Tari? Whiskey? Tari me! You could never unlock my secret. Oh no! Suddenly! No, leave me!
Let's begin.
Indeed.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Honey Badger Radio. My name is Brian, and this is the Fireside Chat. And today I have a very special guest. He's an OG, I think. He's been doing this for a long time. He is a researcher, or he does research work, and he is also, set up a service for veterans, for families and fathers. And and his name is David Mottershead, right? Welcome to the show, David.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, it's good to have you on. And you've been doing this for a while now. Tell us a little bit about like how you got started and what it is that you do specifically.
Okay, so I'm a researcher. I set up the Veteran and Blue Light Service for a charity called Families Need Fathers, Both Parents Matter Cymru here in the UK. We're the only service that helps veterans, coppers, paramedics, fire service personnel going through the family court process, mainly because our service is often used as a reason to stop us seeing our children. And this is what initially got me started with fathers' rights and domestic violence campaigning. I'm a veteran with complex PTSD, so it's hard enough to see past the mental health with me in the best of days. But I was in a domestic violence relationship with my ex-wife as the perpetrator as well. So that complicated things massively because it feeds right into the stereotypes of angry man. He therefore must be at fault. And for 5 years, I was essentially being leathered all over the place and then blamed for it by the very woke social workers that were involved at the time. And it took for one particular professional to get involved before she pointed out that for 4 years I'd been turning up at meetings with black eyes and fat lips and God knows what else.
Wow.
And everyone had been blaming me. And her exact words were, look, if David was doing to her what she's doing to him, we would all be up in arms about it. And that's when things changed. And a MARAC was conducted. I was found to be at medium to high risk of being further abused. She realized her games were up. And she snatched our children, moved, and I've barely seen them since. And I recognised, obviously, that could happen to anyone, which started. So
yeah. Absolutely? That's so terrible. I'm sorry. That's what's crazy is I see this more and more happening more and more with all the men that I know, the men that are my friends in my circles. Like divorce and losing access to kids and losing the house and all these other things. I know that's just anecdotal, but how long has it been since you've seen your kids?
Face to face. My eldest son, I last saw in November 2015, and my youngest son, I last saw in January 2016. I have spoken to them a couple of times since, a handful of times via video call. I've been very lucky. Things have settled in our family now, so mum and myself are communicating much better, and that's allowing for some contact with my children, which is great. It's great to hear their voices. It's great to see them doing so well. But yeah, it was the longest time with nothing, not a single word.
Absolutely.
It's horrible. So.
Yeah, no, I couldn't imagine. So are you can talk to them. How old are they now?
I'd rather keep their details.
Okay, no problem. But I guess are they children or adults? Or?
Yeah, they're in their teens now.
Okay,
so
all right.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm just
they're doing very well.
Okay. Are you so you do a lot of research. I'm looking at your website. You have some papers here. Like, for example, I'll give some titles, and I'll let the chat let me know if there's anything you want me to like dive into a little deeper. But here's one: how feminist campaigning hid the existence of male and LGBTQ victims of domestic violence for nearly 50 years. Miscarriages of justice in relation to male victims of domestic violence / intimate partner violence. Remove the feminist schema to save lives. I'm actually interested in that one. Broken families, the single biggest precursor to multiple deprivations. Feminism or Marxism incognito, how significant are social movements and political parties to the implementation of political ideas. So those are some of the things that you have written. So can you tell me what is the feminist schema for people who may be new to this?
Wow, big question. Start small, shall we? Okay. So at this point, it takes you to the area of Twitter Spaces where they talk about definitions of everything, and feminists always say the same thing. Well, everyone's a feminist because everyone wants equality, but unfortunately, that is not what feminism is. We all want equality because we're all decent people. We want everyone to have the same opportunities, of course. But when you drill down into feminism, at the core premise, it rests upon patriarchal oppression theory, which obviously we hear a lot in normal discourse on social media and in society, how oppressed women are because of the patriarchy. But unfortunately, patriarchal oppression theory turns out to be Karl Marx's oppressive bourgeois family concept. They've taken Morgan's data directly out of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto to prop up the patriarchal oppression theory. And they've used that as the be-all, end-all cause of all issues for women in the world, which is what you're supposed to do with Karl Marx's concepts. You're supposed to find guilt where there is none, assign collective guilt to a huge group, and it is in that conflict that will bring about a culture war, which will lead to the complete collapse of society. And then at the end of that collapse, fingers crossed, communism will arise from the ashes. So that's what it turns out to be.
That's a pretty succinct look at it. So essentially what how I would, and let me know if this is also like another way of sort of saying the same thing. Marxism or communism essentially takes certain things that used to be like sort of material wealth, but because the anti-capitalist argument doesn't work in most Western countries as a result of the ways that people can sort of like, rise out of their circumstances. So what they do is they take other things that are normal and they describe them as a form of capital, and that is a form of capital privilege that has to be, flattened or redistributed or something. So, for example, if you are, look, we can put it in other contexts. So if you're white, then whiteness is a form of capital that needs to be, flattened, and it gives you privilege. If you are male, then being male is a form of capital. And I think that also essentially being in an intact family that is stable and loves each other, and or even like if they're let's say they happen to be religious, and that is like one of the ways that they, one of the things they operate under, all of those things are considered a form of capital, which is inherently oppressive and unequal. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Yeah, I think that's the way they would like to describe it. They'd probably use more fluffy language around it, but unfortunately, all that's underneath it is just pure nihilism. So the people who have brought about this most recent culture war and potentially World War III onto our laps were Marcuse, Derrida, the founders of the Frankfurt School, Michel Foucault, and things like that. And it was actually Derrida that pointed out that the problem with capitalism is it works. It does make people's lives better. And they said that essentially working class people were too stupid to know they're oppressed. So they were going to have to create the conditions in society ready for a revolution, which just essentially means that they were going to put policy and legislation into our institutions that would be societally carnivorous, to put it bluntly, that was intended to cause mass chaos so that we would then come out on the streets and go, oh my God, our institutions are terribly racist and sexist, and we need to burn them to the ground and start again. And that's where the conflict theory is. Again, nobody, like Karl Marx said, nobody's allowed to plan for post-revolution. So their only focus is to destroy everything through those narratives. And that's why there's a paper called The Word Capitalism, the Soviets' gift to the West. And that's because there is no such economic model as capitalism. In actual fact, it was a socialist by the name of LeBlanc who came up with the term, and he was describing how the British government were borrowing money for the industrial war machine that nobody knew how they were going to be able to pay back. And that has just been accepted as somehow an economic model, and that is what we describe all our states as now, when in actual fact, it is a phantom concept designed to make people argue.
Yes,
Right?
yes, that's so good. I'm so glad you said that. I've been saying this forever, and I kind of like thought, I was thinking a lot about this idea of, because people who defend, let's say, markets or the the concept of property rights, they use the word capitalism. And I've been saying forever, guys, stop using the word capitalism. That's their word, right? This is what it always comes back to. They create the terms, and then they put them through the schools and in the media, and they sort of like make them ubiquitous. And then while they're creating the words, they're also creating the sort of paradigm or the framework that we're all like operating within. And then when people who are well-intended people who are speaking in defense of these, sort of common sense, or at least like these practices, are using their words to do it. So you'll see, right-wing people saying, "Oh, I love capitalism," etc. Even people who are supposedly like well-versed in, what the Marxists do, and they're sort of like part of the Mises caucus, which is sort of like our libertarian, caucus model. They'll say the word capitalism, and I'll say, guys, try not to say the word capitalism, because that is their word. You should just say property rights. I mean, as an example, this is the same as like, let's try not to use the word patriarchy.
I think you're hitting on one of the most important parts about all of the what's going on at the moment in terms of the reification of these concepts. So that's what a lot of these concepts are designed to do. Misogyny is the perfect example. Sexism exists in the world on both sides. And when the original theoretic...
just a moment. When you say
sexism
exists, do you mean that people have, preconceived notions about people based on their sex? Or do you mean that they they have a hatred against the other sex?
No. So sexism itself would be a hatred towards the other sex, but we do have these stereotypes as well. So the stereotype that women gossip is 100% correct, and it's a very required part of evolutionary behavior. But it's seen as sexist to point out that it is very much a female trait, isn't it? So it's a complicated area. But the point about sexism is the same as all of these big arguments. They've all been categorized that people can experience differing levels of these things, when it's not true. That's the whole point of the unknown soldier for all of our countries to have one. It's to remove the politics, to remove the skin color, everything else, religion, the lot, and to recognize the individual. And that's what we do with all of our laws. They are explicitly neutral. But these concepts encourage a misapplication of the law to the diagnosed level of apparent oppression that somebody can experience. So misogyny, for example, misogyny is not a thing. In actual fact, that's a sociological term. In the psychiatric world, it's called negative sex-based implicit bias. And the first people who went out and who theorized systemic misogyny, the first people who tested for it were Dunham, Barron, and Bernanke in 2015. And they couldn't find it at all. In fact, they found the exact opposite. They found from the younger to the older a boy to a man you get, the more protective of women you become. And in actual fact, the only negative sex-based implicit bias was from women onto other women and from women onto men and boys. Now, that went under the radar, and we just accepted it as a concept because they pushed it onto us. And even the American Psychiatric Association took it on as something that existed, until they tested it themselves. Last year, I believe May the 19th, the paper came out. They tested over 6,024, something like that, individuals. And they found exactly the same as Dunham, Barron, and Bernanke. There was this negative sex-based implicit bias between women and from women onto men, but directly the opposite for men. We are extremely protective of women. There is no negative. There is only a positive sex-based implicit bias for the majority of men. Now, we've been, as men and boys, targeted by these feminists for so long and told that we're all toxic and horrible, and our relationships have been destroyed with all of these techniques, to the point now that the younger generations are waking up and going, whoa, what's going on here? We're not going to end up with a family. We're not going to end up with what everyone else was promising. We're going to end up old, lonely, and no house because it's gone in a divorce and all of that. So who's got the answers? And all of a sudden, we've got Tate. We've got the alphas. We've got the guys who are offering up the very sexist advice about how to win women. And all of a sudden, we have misogyny being reified, which is the Marxist term for created, into society. So exactly as you described it, this is the creation of a concept through agitation that never used to exist. All because of their sexist behavior.
Yeah, I've said many times, and we have said on this channel many times, that the feminists created the conditions that made people like Andrew Tate and put him, like, you know, and I don't even think Andrew Tate is misogynist. I honestly don't, but he's very, like, opinionated, and he's outspoken, and he's arrogant, and he's got all these, like, negative, like, sort of dark triad qualities. But he's the person that's pushed into lots of other guys like this too, that are pushed into the front. And of course, the feminists and the media and the cathedral, they love this because now they have something they can use to make the example of, and it makes it impossible for us to have a real conversation. But it's their doing, so they create the problem, they perpetuate the problem, and they offer a placebo. They don't actually offer any solutions, and that's so that they can.
Instead of placebo, in actual fact, they offer policy and legislation that almost always makes it worse. In fact, and that's the key characteristic of Marxist policy. It is designed to always do the exact opposite of what it claims, but it only fails at what Hitler called the absurd element, because he used these techniques as well. So it looks very good when you first put it in place, and you can't quite decide whether it's working or not until it hits societal saturation level, and then it collapses under its own weight because it was founded on a phantom concept. So now you have 3 times as many domestic violence victims, and you can see this in the Nordic paradox research. The more of these feminist interventions you put in place to try and resolve domestic violence, the worse the situation gets.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, like, for me, I guess I thought this was kind of obvious, but it seems like it's so hard for people to wrestle with, you know, these concepts. Like, I think it has to do with the fact that we have been propagandized for so long. You know, that the idea that women, like you yourself, you're a veteran. Thank you for your service, by the way. And Veterans Day was just on Monday, which is one of the other reasons why I thought I wanted to have him on. But you know, if you, based on what I see and what I know about your history regarding your service and everything, I think that people would be shocked to hear that you were a victim of domestic violence. And I think it's because we, you know, of these misconceptions. Like, did she use weapons on you? Like, what was the experience like?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of it was psychological. She was thinking years ahead. She was planning years ahead in terms of arguments and things. It was really quite something. It was quite an extreme case. She would most often lash out. She was a big girl. She'd try and punch us in the head, punches in the face, in the back. She went at me with a set of keys in her hand once, and you covered, and I ended up with holes all over my back and everything else. But it was, I mean, the physical violence was as extreme as you would expect of any male perpetrator onto a female. But for me, the hardest part was the psychological stuff. I think most domestic violence victims would probably say that.
Yeah, one of the things we have here in the United States, and I'm so glad because this is actually starting to, like, really make the rounds. I'm seeing more and more people outside of this men's rights space talking about it. Is we have the Duluth model now. Do you know what the Duluth model of it's sort of the wheel of power and privilege? It's like a feminist like way of viewing domestic violence. Do you guys have something like that in the UK?
Actually, all of our domestic violence interventions in the UK are specifically required to hold the Duluth model at its centre. So you're not allowed to run a single domestic violence programme here in the UK unless the Duluth model is informing the intervention, which is obviously extremely dangerous, as I'm sure you're about to mention.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I know that our audience knows that the Duluth model is essentially a feminist framing of every interaction between men and women. It operates under, feminist theory, which is hardly even theory. It's more like, conjecture or presumptions that are unproven, unscientific in every way, but it's the way we operate. But one of the reasons why I brought it up too is because you talked about your experiences. Like, so one of the things that women who want to be abusers will do in the States that's fairly common is they will call the police on their husbands and say that they don't feel safe or they feel threatened or that he hurt them. And of course, instead of having to abuse them themselves, they'll just let the system do it for them. And I was wondering, first of all, have you ever had that happen? Has she ever used the cops on you or other authorities outside, like a third party? And what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so like most female perpetrators of domestic violence, my ex-wife was reliant on third-party abuse. So coercive and controlling forms of abuse is a relatively new phrase. For those who haven't read too much in that side, it's easier to remove all of the complex language and just think of it as passive aggression, triangulating that type of thing.
Weaponized passive aggression. Yeah, that's a good way to, yeah.
Exactly. In the evolutionary anthropological data and in the psychiatric literature, it is recorded as the utilization of gossip and innuendo as a form of reputation salvage with the intent of isolating the target from the wider social community. And it's actually how women set up their hierarchies in adolescence. This is why the phrase "women can be right bitches to each other" exists. So those techniques that women use in their social interactions that they learn in their adolescent years that can truly be vile and really quite destructive at times are employed on average by 99% of female perpetrators of domestic violence. So they will have flying monkey after flying monkey after flying monkey. And I wrote one of the largest studies of its kind, although it's not published, in the UK into the lived experience of male victims of domestic violence. And there were several things that consistently came up. Things like ringing work to gossip about you at work or to cause you trouble at work so that you get in trouble with your boss, you might lose your job. And that's an element of financial control as well as, isolating you from your workmates and things like that. So yeah, it's a huge part of the lived experience of almost every male victim of domestic violence. And it can often take years to unpick the damage done. Often the institutions are obviously on the side of mothers and women because of this 50-year narrative. And especially in the case of if you have a vulnerability like myself, a mental health condition, you may have to spend several years being told you are violent and delusional, blah, 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 pumped with all sorts of antipsychotics, just for them at the end of that 2-year period to go, "We're really sorry, we've realised we made a mistake, we shouldn't have done it." So there's layer upon layer about how these allegations and these forms of abuse can affect you in your own life, whether it's at work or in your therapy or amongst your friends and family. But either way, it is exactly the same behaviour that the feminists use to shut down anyone who tries to have a conversation about male victims of domestic and or sexual violence, funnily enough. So it's quite easy to spot in your own intimate relationship if you think of it in that way. It's often harder to see it happening when it's happening to yourself because you want to have faith in the other person. But if you can look onto Twitter and see Feminist of the Year going after somebody and doxing them, and then you look at your partner and realise, oh, hold on, that's the same behaviour, it makes it a little bit clearer and easier to understand. So.
Yeah, for sure. We'll get to Twitter in a moment, because you seem to be pretty active there, and I don't think it's a bad place to have. I know a lot of people think that it's the worst place ever, but I think it's good that it's more of a like an open dialogue there than it was historically. But I wanted to ask one more thing first. So one of the things that I've seen that is a big topic of discussion and advocacy these days is parental alienation. Canada has, Monique, who's a friend of the channel. She works hard to try to, address that, as well as Justin Trottier. In Australia, there is a group called Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, I think, which is a parental alienation group. And one of the weapons that, I guess you could say ex-wives or parents could use against their, their exes, is this kind of not just parental alienation, but also sort of like conditioning their children against the parents. And since your ex-wife has your kids, has she like tried to do that? Has she tried to get the kids to hate you or anything like that?
Well, I'm not going to talk about my kid's own situation,
Okay.
but it is what I will say is that
we could talk about this in broader strokes, not about your
yeah,
specific.
if that'd be okay,
Yeah.
that'd be great. Yeah,
That'd be fine.
So yeah, thank you, man. You have to remember that one of the more senior judges here in the UK in 2015 went on record and said, look, it now appears that parental alienation appears to have become mainstream here in the UK. Now, that was Casey Wildblood, who's just retired and just moved to Wales, actually. He's currently trying to divert families' cases from the family court to try and save those families, because he recognises the outcomes once they get in there. But yes, so parental alienation, obviously everyone knows what it is. Everyone knows it's child abuse. It's now recognised as domestic violence here in the UK, even though the phrase parental alienation is not in the new domestic abuse bill. The new domestic abuse bill does cover the behaviours. So it is now recognised as domestic violence against the alienated parent and as obviously child abuse against the child. There is now a better intervention for this and for all domestic violence issues. Page 83, I believe it is, of the new domestic abuse bill. It pertains to what's known as the Hertfordshire model, which takes, rather than a judgmental approach to child protection, which is what we've done in the past with domestic violence, this one takes a more appropriate, holistic approach to the family, recognising that only 5% of domestic violence is what we would expect to see in domestic violence in terms of physical violence. The majority is passive aggression. It is, silly name calling and things like that wouldn't take a particularly good therapist to have ever got involved in the past. But in the past, and up until this point in the last year, when it's changed, the feminists have always argued, oh my God, you can't intervene and you can't, have therapists around the children and families when there's domestic violence suggested. What if she dies? What if the children die? And that almost never happens.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's being addressed more, but unfortunately, it might be too late. We are at a stage where most of our relationships fail now. And most children experience single parenting at some point during their childhood, and most children lose contact with their fathers within the first 3 years of separation. So that's most kids in society now losing their dads. And when you filter back, why would that outcome be so important to the feminists? It's not just blind arrogance. It's not just sexism. It's not just bigotry. When you look to see what a culture war is, you will find the Hague Library in the Netherlands. These are all the books that teach us about what steps to keep an eye out for with regards to the bringing about of world wars or genocides. And it turns out that the feminists at their core have always known that they needed to remove the fathers, because that would leave the mothers and the children vulnerable to political predation in the same way, so that they would take on this woke ideology. So this woke ideology is not new. This is not brand new. Every single argument has been made before, and it was made by Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, all of them. Mm-hmm. All we're seeing is the replication of that. And there has only been one of those so-called cultural revolutions that failed, and that was the Hungarian Revolution. And the guy who tried to bring that about wrote a paper saying, look, the reason we failed was because their families were too strong. Their families were too strong due to religiosity. Therefore, as we push West and try again, we must first destroy religiosity and then go after their families. And this is why Churchill and The Hague put a human right to a private family life in the European Convention on Human Rights. It was to prevent fathers being removed so that you could then indoctrinate the children. And yeah, we missed 100%. It. I say we missed it, but I don't see how a single judge in the UK managed to sit on the bench without reading a single book out of The Hague.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's 100%. Again, maybe this is just egocentric or something, but I'm hearing a lot of things that's very validating for things that I have brought up and talked about myself. How I've often said that so essentially this requires the growth of the state so that this, like, or at least there are, let's say that, because a lot of times people say the communists, they don't want a state, they want to live in a stateless society, but they have to destroy everything first, and then this new thing will rise from the ashes like the phoenix. But I think that in order to get there, the state has to be massively powerful so that it is essentially the father or the husband to all of the women and the father to their children. And that's why, we refer to it as big daddy government here in the States. And I think that the only real threat to that, or the largest threat to that, is a father in the home with a family that is, very much like committed to each other. And this is like the purpose of all this. And so like what I'm hearing from you kind of, it confirms what I've been saying. And I mean, like, I don't think that, I think a lot of people agree with me that watch, but I'm just saying it's nice to hear it from someone I've never spoken to before that's sort of like heading in the same direction. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it sucks. There's not many of us that are heading in that direction. I think we've seen a lot of Twitter spaces about things like where did the attack on the family come from and things like that. So people are finally connecting the dots. But I think the hardest lump to get over is the idea that it was all a lie and there was never any equality in it. Do you know what I mean?
For sure.
And that you can, and that you can directly go to Hitler's arguments. The man v. bear argument was Hitler's argument. From the river to the sea was Hitler's argument.
The man versus bear came from Hitler. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because that's super interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So etymologically speaking, it comes from 1938 when he was printing children's books for German children in schools, obviously. That had a picture of a Jewish face with a mushroom that put onto a mushroom and a Star of David on its stomach. And it was just one mushroom in the center with that big nose that you associate with a stereotype, and then a load of other mushrooms in the background. And his argument was, we know not all Jews are dangerous, or we know not all Jews are Gentiles, but we don't know which ones. Therefore, it's a bit like mushrooms. You wouldn't just pick one up and eat one because you don't know which one the poisonous one is. And that's the poisoned Skittle, poisoned M&M, man v. bear argument.
Yeah, it's the M&M's thing. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So when you then consider that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free was Hitler's propaganda argument to the Arabic world. That was the slogan he had. If you don't join me, one day there will be an Israeli state. So now we have two Nazi arguments coming out of the radically left-leaning feminist left. Then in 2018, James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian managed to get Chapter 12 of Mein Kampf published in the top social work journal in the world, specifically focused on child protection. For those who don't know, Chapter 12 of Mein Kampf was Hitler's own words on how members of the Nazi party should behave, but he never actually said the words our party. Nazi party, he said the words our party. So they essentially removed the words our party and put intersectional feminism in there instead, passed it to, again, top social work journal in the world, and they went, oh, this is wonderful. This is great. Yeah. And published it. So what we're seeing now is the evidence that the Fourth Reich were right. And the Fourth Reich were Nazis who scuppered away to Spain just after World War II. The CIA worked with them. There's a great BBC documentary. But they were very clear that fascism always begins on the left. And it agitates the right. The right comes out. And because the narratives are so big and everyone's arguing, the center is forced to take a side. And because the left sounds like lunatics, everyone has no real choice but to come down on the side of the right. And that is how you take normal, hardworking German people and turn them into Nazis. And that's what's happening here.
So that's interesting. I think I guess this might turn into a bit of a political discussion, but I think it has to, because, on some level, that's like the feminism makes the personal political, and they sort of shove it in your face everywhere. So you can't really run from it. I know some people want to, but I'm okay with confronting it. But yeah, I see what's happening. So like in the States, what I think is going on, at least from what I observed, and like I go out, I touch grass, I talk to regular people as often as I can. It's not that, I guess what seems to be happening is the left has gone, further and further left. I don't think it's insane. I think it's completely rational because they know that that's the only way they're going to get to what they want. They have to keep pushing the Overton window further and further left until everything is destroyed so that they can build the new social man, you know, like has to come out of that. And I think that what's happening is it's not so much that people are moving right. It's that they're just not there. It's like the paradigm, in my opinion, is there's the left and then there's the non-left, which is sort of like everybody else, which means that they're all divided in their own way. Like some, you know, are moderates, some are libertarians, some are casual, like sort of like classical liberals. Some of them are right wing or paleocons or whatever. And so they all have a bunch of stuff that they're not really in lockstep with. And meanwhile, the left becomes tighter and tighter because it's trying harder and harder. So it ends up pushing more and more people out of itself. And but what the reaction now could go, at least from the normal people in the United States, can go one of two ways. I think most likely what will happen is it's sort of like a you know, the father is like the children are in the home and they're making a mess of things and they're like playing and they're leaving things out and their toys are lying around everywhere and they've broken stuff or whatever, and then they get the phone call and it's the father saying, I'm coming home, and the kids are cleaning up so that it doesn't look like a mess when he gets there. That's the most likely direction it's going to go, but there is definitely a threat of an overreaction that we should be, you know, on the lookout for. An overcorrection, rather.
Well, I mean, that's the entire point. That's what the technique they're using is rules for radicals, and it is designed to push us over the edge. They're reliant, and you know, Karl Marx, every single one of them is very clear that they were reliant on our reaction. And the problem with the reaction that we have is it's a terrible, as extreme as this sounds, it is a perfectly normal reaction for the German people to have gone the way of the Nazis, given the provocation. And what I mean by that is that the techniques that these people are using are so abhorrent, so evil, that it is deliberately designed that way so that you cannot avoid but react. Everyone will have to react at some point over these issues. And if we ignore them, which is what the institutions and the government would like to do, it will only make the situation worse. So let's just pretend for a moment that trans doesn't exist and that they tried to transition the children in the failed Hungarian Revolution of 19, whatever it was, and that they published a book saying that it wasn't in fact about gender, and that it was about the reduction of internal man from concrete possibility to abstract subjectivity, which leads under all circumstance to a deep dissolution of the contours of personality and a kind of schizophrenic split. The point being that they're trying to make violent political activists 100 years ago out of trans kids, and they were specifically hypersexualizing the children in schools.
Wait, that's happening now.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same technique.
Yeah,
exactly the same technique. So if trans doesn't exist and it is just a provocation technique, then we are butchering our children right now for no reason. And I use that as an example to show you of how extreme it is. You will not get to sit and rest on your laurels here. Nobody will. At some point you will have to react, and at that point, because of the level of extremity, every single one of us would be normal and human to overreact. And that's the only place where you can stop a culture war from turning into a genocide or a world war. Yeah. Can you accept that you will react, but then have the temperance to react appropriately rather than overreact?
Yeah, and that's kind of like how I've been trying to, you know, live, at least for my part, because like obviously you can't make other people react the way that you think they should, but I'm with you on that. For example, go ahead.
I've got bad PTSD. I've got bad PTSD. I react badly all over the internet all the time, man. Everyone will tell you that. So I just want to point out that I'm relying on you guys reacting perfectly, because I can't.
Oh, well, I don't know if it's perfect, but for example, you know, we had in the summer of 2020, I was living in Chicago, which is where I was born and raised, and I thought I was gonna basically die there. Like that was just gonna be my home from start to finish. And there were these violent riots, and they were violent, and there was, you know, riots and buildings were burned down and businesses, and I thought the parts of the city where this is happening, they will never recover, at least not in my lifetime. For example, there are parts of Chicago that never recovered from the assassination of Martin Luther King because of the riots that came after that. So, and my wife, who was Canadian, she was living with me at the time, and she was not accustomed to this kind of thing, because, you know, she was in Canada. That sort of thing didn't happen, although it was happening there as well. And so we decided to move, and we moved to Virginia. And I lost, like, you know, even though I spoke out, like I tried to be rational, I tried to speak out about what was happening, I tried to explain how this was all part of essentially the same thing we've been talking about. It's all intentional, you know, unraveling of everything so that it's all burned down. It's just multiple vectors you can come at this from. I think that COVID was part of it too. It was weaponized
100%.
in the same way. Yeah, 100%, right? And so,
sorry to interrupt. Did you know he snuck in Paolo Freire to the second WEF conference in 1989 in Switzerland? He had to sneak him in because it was still illegal for Marxists to speak to public in Switzerland at the time.
So they scanned. That Paolo Freire, the guy who essentially is probably a nonce that wrote about queering the child. That's the guy, right?
Responsible for our education system. Yeah, pretty much.
Yes, which we're dismantling, or at least hoping to. But so what I tried to do is I didn't overreact. I tried to stay calm. I stated my case. I allowed my friends to essentially stop talking to me, and I just waited. And I thought, okay, we're just going to measuredly, you know, address all of these issues. And I think that's what's starting to happen for a lot of people in the States anyway. Like this last election, despite all of the strong reactions, everyone I know is basically like, okay, so we're just going to address the problems. It's kind of like, you know, trying to be rational and not delicate, but, you know, firm. And we're going to address the problems. We're not going to overreact. We're not going to overcorrect, or at least we're hoping that everyone will be on the same page. But that's definitely the goal. And when we won the election, I was one of the people, at least that I knew, that was not as shocked as others, because I was like, I had a feeling this was going to work out. And it was a gut thing. But I was like, okay, so now this is done. The sort of like, you know, let's say the top down effort to destroy everything has been halted, and maybe the best thing or the worst thing that happens is that, you know, it's only a delay for 4 years, and then it continues after that. But I think that there is a strong effort from very, you know, as men primarily. Also, it was men that mostly stepped up and made this happen. Like, I mean, more than they have in the past. I'll put it that way. Yeah. They're more aware of their problems. They're more aware of their, you know, sort of the propaganda against them, because we've had anti-male propaganda for what, 100 years, probably going back further. For as long as there's been propaganda, there's been anti-male propaganda, you know. And I think that this is like they are trying to address that, and I think it's going to be maybe cautiously optimistic that we're going to be able to do so without overreacting.
I really like the idea of that, and I'm hopeful that that is the case. Unfortunately, I was given evidence on October the 9th last year, 2 days after Israel, that we might not be. And I initially thought, this is just crazy. This is not true. The so-called intelligence I've been given here is nonsense, but it's unfortunately turned out to be true. And the only thing that's missing is that they said that the perfect storm would come by the end of this year, latest early next year, and that it would settle around Trump being told he wasn't allowed to take over his presidency. And I wouldn't take that seriously were it not for the fact that on October the 9th last year, they told me that the riots at the start of summer would be horrifying here in the UK, but they wouldn't be the ones that were dangerous. In actual fact, it would be the ones at the end of the summer, centering around the Trump stuff, that would have the potential to cause thousands of deaths. So for me, I'm trying to be in a hopeful place, but at the same time, because this guy was able to accurately predict what happened with Southport, you know, this was a potential ricin attack. I have to take it a little bit more serious. So I'm
Oh
waiting
yeah,
to get
I
over
get
the
that.
goalpost of Trump taking office before I'm too hopeful. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I get that. I think that there is going to be a lot more chaos, but again, it sort of I'm not denying that at all. But I think that it ultimately comes down to, you know, can we remain steadfast and still do the right thing despite everything? And I don't know. We'll see. But you mentioned, you know, that what we were talking right before the show, that you had your Arms to Stay and your is it also you also have Veterans Day, something like that, and that there
Well, we had
were
Remembrance on the Sunday and
remembrance, yes,
Armistice on the
remembrance,
Monday.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that there were riots, protests, something like that.
Yeah, we had Palestinian protests in Birmingham, which it is frustrating. I don't know how the rest of the armed forces feels about this, but you know, of all days, that should be the one day that nobody's allowed to protest. It doesn't matter whether you're Palestinian or not. But considering the fact that the British armed forces fought the Palestinians because they sided with Hitler during the war, it was especially insulting. So yeah, it's frustrating. But again, these
But
huge portions of these
is this
communities.
also part of that whole, you know,
Oh yeah,
essentially this,
100%.
yeah, like creating that
Yeah, yeah.
the dialectic, yeah.
Well, this is the problem. So most people haven't. This is where people need to scale out their perception, and this offers us the best chance of shutting down any major problems. So a culture war, race is downstream from culture. Religion is downstream from culture. Sex is downstream from culture. Gender is downstream from culture. So all of these big things are coming out of a cultural revolution, and they truly. There are people within overseas communities, both in this country and external, who understand that we are in a culture war and that all they have to do is sow chaos in society. And this is why there was a handful of guys coming across with the usual economic migrants about a year and a half ago through Greece. And as soon as they got through the border, 3 or 4 of them took their lighters out, started lighting dry grass. And that's because they were trying to set forest fires. They were trying to sow chaos in any way they could. So if there are individuals, and the reason they're doing that is because they've read Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf teaches you how to do that. It teaches you it in the same way as Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. It just uses different language and labels. Yeah, it is definitely all interlinked. And when you follow it backwards as well, when we consider the DEI stuff that's being forced on all our institutions and into our schools by the United Nations, we essentially have the United Nations, who have really bad, radically left-leaning history, who have been who are trying to indoctrinate all our children in schools, despite the fact that they know why the European Convention on Human Rights has a right to a private family life. So they know what they're doing. At the same time as UNRWA are publishing books in Palestine, teaching the children there to want to kill Jews. So we have one organization indoctrinating all our children around these massive conflict subjects. It's not hard. I do not like the deconstruction of anything, but that is one institution that cannot and will not survive this. If I survive this, the UN won't.
Yeah. Well, did you hear that the UN is itself a kind of like, I don't know, hermetic institution?
Yeah, I served with them out in Kosovo, and they were extremely dangerous out there. While we were out there driving defensively, they were taught to drive aggressively, and they were causing thousands of deaths on the road with their dodgy driving. Kids were dying all sorts. It was horrible. So I've hated them since that point. But then when James Nuzzo did that research, the gamma bias research into the United Nations, and he found 26,000 academic papers about women's health on their website. And then when he looked for men's, he found 19 for men. And I don't mean 19,000, I mean 19. It was just like, oh, hold on a sec. And then all of this DEI stuff comes up, and then UNRWA comes up, and then they called it a data center underneath the UNRWA center. A data center is an intelligence command center. Where the intelligence comes into, that's where your commanders are. They want it sooner than everyone else. So the United Nations are 100% trying to push us into a bloody revolution.
Yeah.
100%.
So I haven't heard anything crazy. So why are you always getting into fights on Twitter? What's that about?
Okay,
Like,
so
what does that come from? Yeah, go ahead.
so I'm an effective campaigner, and I've always had that pushback. But the pushback changed when I got a referral to the Prevent program, and that was for that essay that I wrote that's on ResearchGate there. And I've actually changed the title to "This essay resulted in a referral to the Prevent program." For those who don't know, the Prevent program is an anti-extremist program that was used by the radical left for, since its inception until now, 78% of all referrals, bearing in mind that it was supposed to be about Islamic extremism, 78% of all referrals turned out to be by radically left-leaning teachers and lecturers for children and students who had conservative, or what they termed incel beliefs. So 78% of all referrals were politically motivated by the radical left. They obviously have slapped me with the same badge that they have everyone: far-right misogynistic incel.
Are you an incel too? Oh, look,
yeah,
I'm one of those.
Yeah, well, yeah. Apparently, according to the Guardian, I was found guilty in a court case of that, but I'm not. I've got 3 kids. I've been married once. I'm definitely not an incel, and I wasn't found guilty either. I was found not guilty in less than 10 minutes. This is it. But these feminists that keep coming after me, they're using that article every single time, going, "Oh my God, you were like found guilty and you're an incel." I was like, "No, I'm not guilty in less than 10 minutes. Married, 3 children." Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So I think what it is, and I think Erin Pizzi and Honey Badger will agree with this as well. The more effective you are as a campaigner, the worse the stalking and harassment gets.
Yeah,
and it's interesting that these.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, okay, they say that you're over the target because you're getting hit with flack. So that's how you know. And I think that's what it is. Yeah. I think you're really effective. They have to stop you. And it's really funny. They always do this thing where I made this comment just the other day on a show. I said the funny thing about the left is that everything comes from. They have these certain appeals they do because they're trying to essentially validate something that is anti-reality. And the way that they do it is they make appeals to, a couple things. One is authority. Dr. Fauci knows what he's doing. That's how I know that this, the vaccine is safe and effective because Dr. Fauci said so. Are you, a licensed pharmacist? Are you part of Big Pharma? Are you accredited in whatever way? You can't be like an independent researcher because that means you're not credible. The other thing they do is they appeal to consensus. They'll say, these papers are from a college and they have been peer reviewed and they're, all of these feminists co-signed on this thing. Therefore, the wage gap is real. The 1 in 4 women will be, sexually assaulted in their lifetime thing is real because all of this came from these people. Or they'll appeal to, like sort of like a majority viewpoint. Like if your candidate in the election won the electoral college, but they didn't get the majority of votes, like they didn't get the actual majority, they'll say, well, look, our person is better because they got the majority. And if any of those things are shattered, they lose their minds because now they have to figure out what they believe is still true because they won't accept that they might be wrong, that they just can't do that. So instead they have to say, well, there's got to be some other reason why this is true. And that's what they're doing to you. They're saying, well, look at these articles written about you. This must be true because, the journalists that we like, they're obviously like, they're just better people. They're whatever. It's like they idolize that because it validates them and they don't have to experience the kind of cognitive dissonance that comes out of their sunken cost, there's sunken cost into it, right?
Yeah, I mean, the psychology behind the indoctrination process for young girls into feminists is exactly the same as the trans community. And what they're doing is and the Marxists explain this very well, we all have a void between the ego and our outside world, and we present it, we perform who we are every day. But in these techniques, they shift that void to between the ego and the self. So you're no longer fighting with your sense of identity with the outside world. Now it's you. And when you unpick the evidence around their sense of identity in that manner, it creates an extreme level of cognitive dissonance. And this is why you see the heightened suicide rate amongst the trans community, because at some point they have to internalize that process themselves and they're not getting the support. So I get triggered as much. I get triggered by very specific circumstance, though. And most people haven't cottoned onto it yet. People need to use me as a litmus test. I've had no therapy from an extremely psychologically abusive domestic violence relationship. So where would you expect to see, even as a basic layman, where would you expect to see triggers with me? Passive aggression?
Yeah.
Manipulation? So when I go into these Twitter spaces and there are people flying under the radar being little shits, I really lose my shit with them, because some you can reach. They're kids and they need to be told that what they're doing is bullying and fucking disgusting and they need to stop. Others are more perverse. Those individuals are fully versed on the Hegelian dialectic. They come into the room, they assume an identity that they think will fly under the radar with the specific intent of guiding the dialectic in their favor. So you might think you've made friends with these individuals and you spent a long time with them and, oh yeah, we all like the same stuff, it's great. But they will be sat there in the background planning, how can I make this individual do this for me? How can I make this individual do this for me? How can I make them say what I want them to say? And so the entire relationship with those individuals is beyond fake. It is amongst the most, because of the techniques they're using, because they're almost expert in the techniques they're using, because nobody's a full expert, they must have sat down at some point and read Hitler used these techniques. And they have to have sat there and gone, but I'm better than Hitler. Yeah. And that's what fucking pisses me off. Excuse my French, everyone.
No, that's all
right. When I know somebody's that leveled and they're in there playing those games, I'll peel that person's face off to expose them.
Rhetorically.
Yes, of course.
All right, well, we're gonna head into the after show. I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the things that you brought up in a space that I hung out with you in, but I'm not going to do it on the main show. And we're going to talk a little bit about Peter Wright's work and your thoughts on that. And so yeah, if you guys want to join us there, you have to become a badger and go to feedthebadger.com /subscribe and join us. I think it will be a pretty good discussion, so I hope I'll see you guys there. And if you give it higher levels, you can even join the Zoom call and talk to David personally. I actually put the wrong name here. Hold on. I got to fix that later. I'm sorry, guys. It's David. I don't know why I mistyped and wrote Davis, but it's actually in the title correctly and in the description correctly. But anyway, is there any last words you want to give to people before I sign off here and we go into the patron show?
Just that the key characteristic of a culture war is that the target group has suicide rates through the roof, and that there will be lots of blokes who are listening who are struggling. I want you to know that you're not alone, and that there are plenty of people like me out there who can help you. You don't have to go through it on your own. Just reach out, please.
All right. Well, thank you. That's well said. Links to David's things. I got his Twitter and your website where your writings are at. I don't know why I'm spacing on that. Your publications are in the description, as well as your Twitter page. Follow him there, and maybe if you see him inside of a Twitter space, jump in and just enjoy the fireworks. But thank you guys so much for coming on today's show. If you guys like this video, please hit like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, hit the bell for notifications, leave us a comment, let us know what you guys think about what we discussed on the show today, and please share this video, because sharing is caring. I want to thank again David Mottershead for joining me on the show today, and I want to thank you guys for watching. We'll talk to you guys in the next one. Have a good one, everybody.
Are machines, dude. Okay, they are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.